So hello everybody and welcome back for day 2 of the 9th annual America's Spectrum Management Conference. It's great to see so many of you again joining us on the platform for today. I can see that it is filling up nicely, so welcome to all of you. In total yesterday, I think we had more than 300 people participating directly via the platform, and I'm informed that there's about 200 more who are watching via the live streams that we have on Twitter and YouTube. So altogether, I think we had more than 500 people following the various sessions yesterday, which is fantastic. And as I said, it's great to have all of you back here again for the sessions today. So we had a great start to the proceedings yesterday. We had 2 really interesting plenary panel discussions, plus of course our keynote interventions from FCC Chairman Ajit Pai and Commissioner Jeffrey Starks. And if you missed any of that, then don't worry. The recordings from all of the sessions are now available for you to watch again. You should have received an email which was sent after the end of the event yesterday, which had the links on for how to access all of the sessions. So you can use that to watch back any sessions that you want to view again, or anything that you might have missed. And in addition, you can also find that link and the recordings up on the reception page of the platform. So you can go to the reception page and you'll find the link to the recordings there. And that's going to be continued throughout the duration of the event. So all of the sessions are being recorded and will be available to watch back for anything that you're maybe not able to watch live, or anything that you do want to watch again. So on to today. So again, we have a fantastic and very busy day ahead of us. So we have 2 main sessions taking place today, and we also have the first of our showcase sessions, and we have the first opportunity for all of you out there in the audience to bring your audio and video feed live, and actually to come up onto the stage and be part of the discussions here. So you can see on the screen next to me here the agenda for today's proceedings. So we're starting off very shortly with a session that's going to be focusing on developing a policy blueprint to deliver 5G leadership. So looking at progress, challenges and opportunities in that area there. That's going to be for about an hour and 10 minutes. And then straight away after that, we're moving into our first round of showcase sessions. So the showcase sessions are sessions that are being led by some of our partner organizations at the event. And we're delighted on these, the first round of showcases that we have, to have three different sessions running today. So you can see here, the first one on showcase stage 1 is going to be looking at ONGO CBRS shared spectrum, early lessons learned from the CBRS band. So that's hosted by CBRS Alliance. Then on showcase stage 2, we have the session Satellites and 5G, the last mile and more, which is being hosted by GVF and GSC. And then on showcase stage 3, we have a session which is looking at 5G and edge, transformational performance with 5G and mobile edge computing, and that's being hosted by Verizon. So 3 excellent sessions which are going to be taking place immediately following the session which is going to be starting very shortly. Those will be on the showcase stages. So if you click on the stage icon at the left-hand menu bar, you can then select which stage you want to go to, and you'll see different showcase stages to access all of those. Following that, we then have a short break, time to catch our breath, before we then move to our second plenary session of the day, which is going to be looking at technology and policy tools to increase spectrum efficiency. So looking to the future at some of the different options to try and increase spectrum efficiency. And finally, we're wrapping up today with, as I said, the first of our Have Your Say sessions. So I'll talk more about this later, but that's going to be an opportunity for all of you out there in the audience to actually come live onto the event platform, to bring your audio and video feed live and give your thoughts on what your key conclusions are, your key thoughts, takeaways from the sessions that are taking place so far. So we have another very busy day ahead of us. So without further ado, I'd like to get going. So I would now like to bring up to the stage Andy Hudson. Hi, Andy. So
Hi, Dan.
He is going to be moderating our first session this morning, which we're really looking forward to. So Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate it. And first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you guys for putting on such a great conference in obviously difficult times. Now you're doing a fantastic job. So we're going to be talking in this session about a blueprint for 5G leadership. And we've got a wonderful panel. I'm going to introduce the panel to you quickly first, and then just say a few words about the topic and what we're going to talk through. So we've got 4 people on the panel, 2 regulators, and 1 person from the mobile industry and 1 person from the satellite industry. So it should be a really good mix to talk through these topics. So the first person is Nesse Gundelsberger, and she's the Deputy Bureau Chief for the International Bureau at the FCC. She's got 20 years of experience at the FCC, was an international lawyer before that, and I think we'll be able to add a lot of detail to what we heard yesterday from Ajit Pai in his excellent plenary session at the start. So that sets us up with what the US is doing. We don't want to leave out Canada, so we've got David Willis for you, who is the Senior Director at the Canadian regulator. He looks after spectrum standards, engineering and planning. He led the Canadian delegation to WRC 19, so has a lot of experience there on that international side. And previously he worked for BlackBerry and Nortel Networks. So I think we can ask him a few questions as well about the industry side as well. Not just a regulator and industry experience. That's really nice. We've then got Jennifer Manner, who is the Global Spectrum and Regulatory Policy Person for the Global Satellite Coalition. But she's also in a day job, the SVP at EchoStar Hughes for network systems. And before that, she also had senior roles at the FCC. So again, an interesting mix of industry experience and the FCC experience. So we can't let these guys get away without understanding both sides. So hopefully some really good questions from you, the audience, that we can use there. And of course, no panel would be complete here if we're talking about spectrum without somebody from the mobile side as well. So we've got Patrick Welsh, who is the Director for Federal Government Affairs at Verizon. But just to make sure that we're fair to everyone, before joining Verizon, he was at T-Mobile and interestingly also at American Tower. So I think when we get to talking a little bit about some of the infrastructure and the things that you need to do to actually support 5G and rollout, I think he'll also have some interesting perspectives from maybe earlier on in his career. Maybe we can take him back to that. So that's the panel. We're going to be talking about 3 main things. First of all, progress. So where are we in the US and Canada on 5G? Where does the US sit compared to Asia and other parts of the world? What are the national plans and how are they progressing in both of those countries? And what's happening in terms of spectrum, mid-band and millimeter wave progress? Obviously important because we're thinking of the spectrum side always. Now, we're then going to go and talk a little bit about the challenges and what are the challenges to being a 5G leader? What are the challenges that are specific to the US, but also the more general ones around the world? And what needs to be done to overcome them? I think one of the key ones there is that site acquisition that we were talking about. So it'll be interesting to hear both from the operator perspective, but also the regulatory perspective, what's being done to make that rollout easier. And then we're going to talk about opportunities and some of the global and regional initiatives which are done to support this. But before I dive into the panel, I just want to raise a couple of questions because I never like to keep Dan, too comfortable. So I always like to, add a couple of slightly different questions or things for us to think about. And the first one here is, what does 5G leadership mean? We're certainly talking about the 5G era. We're talking about not just 5G as a technology, but IoT, big data, AI, and how they all come together. But are we talking about 5G leadership in terms of service quality and availability? Or are we perhaps talking about it in terms of mass adoption across society, businesses, consumers, and how 5G is actually used? Or are we indeed talking about technology leadership in terms of national security threats or in terms of building up a capability to be able to, push business and industry from a leadership perspective in terms of growing it? And they're all different views of leadership, but they're ones which certainly in the UK, I know that we've struggled with what we're actually trying to achieve when you put public funding, public money into that 5G leadership idea. So I'm really interested to understand from the regulator's perspective what we mean by 5G leadership. What is it? And secondly, from industry's perspective, what needs to be done to support that? And my second question or challenge is whether the terminology we're using here, I notice in the write-up here is, how can the US or how can Canada win in the global battle for 5G leadership? And is it really a battle? Are we really fighting for limited resources? And it is one country versus another country. Is it actually just a race about the headlines? Are we using that analogy of a race or a battle to focus the best minds on doing the things that we need to make 5G successful? And is it about that press positioning which drives forward success and push? Or is it really about a very deep and sustainable and competitive advantage? Is this about creating a new economic order, or indeed preserving the existing economic order? And what does that mean in terms of regions competing with each other, with all the geopolitical things that are going on, and also being in the middle of a COVID crisis? So just to throw a few ideas in before we get into the panel, and please send lots of questions as we go through that. I know Dan mentioned that there's some voting that's going to be going on, and we'll certainly be very interested to hear how you vote in those two questions, and we'll pull those into the panel and the panel discussion so far. Okay, so thank you very much. And with no further ado, I will pass on to Nessa, who is going to give us the FCC's view. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you, Forum Global, for inviting me. And I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Next slide. The 5G ecosystem is becoming central to every issue we face, as we are seeing during pandemic, where homes are becoming offices, classrooms, and clinics. We see how important it is, the high-speed connectivity for healthcare, education, and even our own jobs. To realize the potential of 5G, FCC has developed a 5G fast plan, which has 3 ingredients, essential part. One is pushing more spectrum into the marketplace and making sure that we are updating our infrastructure policy, and we are modernizing outdated regulations. Next slide. On the spectrum front, the FCC has been taking a number of actions. We want to make sure that the spectrum is available in the high, mid, and low bands. And we have already auctioned on the high bands, 24 gigahertz, 28 gigahertz, 37, 39, 47 gigahertz bands. And we continue to examine other bands in the high band frequency range for flexible use. We approach licensing in a flexible use perspective, and making sure that we are technology neutral. In the mid bands, FCC has made spectrum available, approximately 844 megahertz of spectrum at this point, in the 2.5, 3.5, and 37 gigahertz bands. And last month, FCC proposed another 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band. With that, we will make lots of spectrum available in the mid-band range. In the low band, we have been also acting to improve the use of our low band spectrum. As you know, low band is useful for wider coverage, and mid-band has both coverage and the capacity advantages. In the low band, we had made targeted changes to the 600 megahertz, 800, and 900 megahertz bands. Of course, we are approaching technology neutral way and trying to make spectrum available for all technologies. And the FCC allocated spectrum to other critical technologies, including for unlicensed use and satellite-based services. Next slide. Once we have the spectrum, making sure that the spectrum is being used, we need the infrastructure. A balanced infrastructure policy removes the unnecessary barriers to deployment. Providers need to install hundreds of thousands of small cells. So if there's a new construction or co-location on an existing infrastructure, state and local approvals are required, and also compliance with the FCC's environmental and historic preservation rules are required. Since 2017, among others, FCC streamlined the wireless infrastructure siting review process and addressed the conduct of some state and local governments that slowed down or increased the cost of wireless infrastructure deployment. In the wake of these decisions, there has been a significant acceleration of next-generation wireless facility deployments. Next slide. The third pillar of our 5G FAST plan is modernizing our regulations to promote more fiber deployment. 5G isn't just about wireless. We also need strong wired background. And to carry all this traffic and also offload some of the data and others from the airwaves. Accordingly, the FCC has modernized its regulation to encourage the deployment of optical fiber for backhaul, and all those things that are listed there helped to accomplish that. Next slide. So 5G will connect everything to everything, and any 5G plan needs to also take into account that we do not afford to make risky choices. We must make sure that the network security is addressed to safeguard personal, economic, and national security. The FCC prohibited the use of its USF funding to purchase equipment or services from any company that poses a national security threat to the integrity of US communication networks and the communication supply chain. The COVID-19 pandemic also has demonstrated as never before the importance of these networks for employment and economic opportunity, education, healthcare, social and civic engagement, and staying connected with family and friends. So it is imperative that we safeguard this critical infrastructure from potential security threats. The FCC continues to integrate provision of the Secure and Trusted Communication Network Act into its supply chain proceeding. Thank you. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you. That was really helpful, and I think it's probably given lots of thought for people to think of specific questions or how we position that. So maybe if we can now go over to David and have a view of what's happening in Canada.
Hi everyone, and thanks Andy, and welcome everyone today. We'll start off, I guess, with some slides, and probably one that's a bit more dense than you'd like to start off with, but we'll start with a view of our spectrum outlook in Canada, which is how, if you can go to the next slide, Andy, which is how we lay out what bands we're looking at. It's a 5-year plan. Effectively, this one was established from 2018 to 2022, and it reflects sort of at the top, our top tier priority bands for releases, a second tier and a third tier. Doesn't reflect all of the satellite activities that are underway, but more of the bands for fixed mobile services. And a couple of things to highlight on here is over the last year, we've actually upgraded a couple of the bands. So we're taking a couple of the bands, 3650 to 4200 and 5925 to 7125, have been upgraded from priority 2 bands to priority 1 bands that are being more actively worked. And I'll speak to more of that shortly. I think one of the other things that we would also highlight is that when you take a look at it, it's not just important to be looking at bands for releases for 5G or for mobile services. It's also important that we have the backhaul capacity and the unlicensed spectrum that is necessary to support all the services. So you'll see things like 64 to 71, 70 gigahertz backhaul and 80 gigahertz backhaul, as well as other backhaul bands in the priority 2 and priority 3 areas. If we go to the next slide then, we'll take a look at a few more of the direct 5G bands. So in terms of 3500 megahertz, on March 5th, we issued the results of our second consultation that contains our policy and licensing framework for spectrum in that band. The key decisions included licenses being auctioned at a tier 4 level, which used to be our smallest licensing chunks. There's about 170 of them, and for a 20-year term. We currently now have a smaller chunk, but the decision was to go for that relatively small chunk at a tier 4 level. Competitive measures have been put in place, which in most of the cases set aside 50 megahertz for smaller and regional competition. And consistent with our previous auctions, there are deployment requirements to ensure that licenses get used in a timely manner, including some specific focus on rural deployment, which with COVID has become a key thing. Since this is a session really on how do we get to 5G quickly, the next item might look a little bit different, but due to the effects of COVID-19, the start of our 3500 auction was pushed out by 6 months to June 15th, 2021. And that really was to accommodate the preparatory activities and provide certainty when we were updating the date to people who might be involved in the auction. There was a lot of preparatory work and uncertainty around capital and staffing at the time that the auction was reset, and we wanted to give certainty around where that was going to be. We can go to the next slide. To emphasize the ongoing priority and the growing importance of mid-band, and reflect some of what we've seen from our neighbors to the south, we have extended and launched the 3800 megahertz band consultation that came out on August 27th, and it looked at some key proposals around repurposing the upper portion of the mid-band. So it looks at repurposing up to 330 megahertz from 3650 to 4200 for flexible use. Looks at transition plans for our existing users. Looks at 80 megahertz. One of the proposals is to include 80 megahertz of shared use spectrum within that 330, and an accelerated repurposing proposal from Telesat is also included in the consultation. If I can go next to the next slide. Our millimeter wave decision on spectrum allocation came out in June of 2019. The key decisions there was for 4.85 gigahertz of spectrum in the 26, 28, and 37 to 40 gigahertz bands. You'll note that many of these bands overlap the US. The one distinction is there is an allocation because of our different incumbency in Canada for 26.5 to 27.5 gigahertz that would overlap more of the international activities in that band. The band plans are aligned with the international standards. The measures, and one of the key things that we did here was really to spend a lot of time, and it's an ongoing and an evolving discussion to ensure coexistence between fixed and mobile services and the various satellite services in those bands, including a structure around Earth stations that we're continuing to get feedback on. In addition, in that decision, the allocation of the 64 to 71 gigahertz band for license exempt use was completed. We are planning on consulting further on the licensing and auction framework for 26, 28, and 37, 6 to 40 shortly, but lots of priorities in that chart you saw at the start. We can go to the next slide. This is more to help people understand the mix of millimeter wave potential future spectrum releases in 24, in 40 to 43, or in 48. And obviously, we continue to see sharing in many of these bands, so it's not an exclusive release model that might be being contemplated, and ongoing priority on backhaul and other uses. If we go to the next slide, I think one of the other things that we wanted to emphasize was, jumping one too far ahead. We also wanted to flag that given the developments that we've seen in the US on 6 gigahertz and elsewhere globally, I think Brazil, Korea, Japan, We are following those global developments. We've been doing our own technical studies, and we are preparing for a future consultation on that band. We have slightly different incumbencies than in the US, and we're working on addressing those slight differences. If I move to the last slide before I run out of time, the other thing we've been trying to look at in a 5G context, and I think people look at things as being sort of a continuous, as a discrete thing as opposed to continuous. And I think we tend to look at it as a continuous or incremental. Certainly in Canada, we've seen 5G deployments in existing allocated mobile bands. We've been actively working on technical rules to address MIMO and to support deployment of 5G services in existing bands. We're also working on the technical rules in the license exempt bands as we speak. We've also spent a bunch of time looking at recognizing the challenges in terms of spectrum availability and the need for increased sharing, looking at all of the things that we would need to do from a regulatory perspective to ensure that we do better spectrum sharing, in particular using databases. It's become very clear through looking at experiences in other jurisdictions that accurate, high quality incumbent data is important, that upgrading and modernizing our technology is important, and working on some of the regulatory base that underlies the rules and the legal aspects is important. And we're doing work in each of those areas to facilitate the transition and innovation that's required going to 5G. So I think I'll pause there and pass it on to others.
Great, thank you. Lots of really interesting angles there that I think we'll probably get into in the discussion. So thank you for that perspective. I'm now going to pass over to Jennifer. I think you're going to tell us about the satellite perspective. Well, I hope you are.
You're on mute, Jennifer. Sorry.
Thank you. That's the problem of having a dog, is you have to keep your computer on mute most of the time. So good morning, everyone. Very excited to be here. Really, if you can go to the next slide, I want to talk to you about a part of 5G that I think was largely missing from the discussion we just heard from David and Neshe, which while Neshe did mention fiber as well as wireless, David focused solely on wireless as 5G. And as many of you know, there's a lot of work going on in 3GPP, and there's been a lot of work going on around the globe on ensuring that 5G is not just wireless, and not just wireless and fiber, that it includes multiple technologies. And one of the technologies that I believe will be critical, and as we saw during the pandemic, for ensuring that people have access to services wherever they are, is satellite. So really, when you think about 5G, and there is no set definition for 5G, if you go, there's no body that decides what does 5G mean. But even if we look at 3GPP right now is working on non-terrestrial technologies being part of release, the next release 17. So I would argue, and I think this is a fair position, is that 5G is going to be supported by diverse technologies and platforms, including satellite. And satellite has an important role in a number of areas. These are just a few that I've identified, but of course, we think of remote and unserved or poorly served areas where there's really not much there besides maybe DSL. Mobile platforms, I think we've been extremely successful and will continue to be extremely successful at connecting planes, ships, and other conveyances. Smart cities, the cloud, machines to machines. How do we get service out widely to all the different connectivity? You can think of it in terms of utilities and disaster affected regions. And I would say pandemics. I mean, we've seen huge increases, just like the wireless industry has during the pandemic, on the need for more services. So satellites are really important as we provide reliable, seamless coverage and really high resiliency. So when you think about 5G, you can't just think, how do I get spectrum out to the terrestrial wireless industry? You really need to think of it as a balanced distribution of spectrum as well as protection. Next slide, please. So this kind of builds on this. On the fiber, microwave, mobile, the terrestrial technologies, they are great, and certainly not saying they're not, but they're not always available. They're not always reliable, and they have other shortcomings, just as any technology does. And so when you look at satellites, we're really an exciting area. Some people call it new space, just call it space. But satellite in particular, you're seeing for the first time true deployment of a multiple orbits of satellites, whether it's LEO, and I would point to OneWeb, who my company who has a partnership with, or SpaceX, or SES-03B. There's really exciting things coming. I mean, you start to see cost-effective, high speed, low latency LEOs and MEOs. You still have the high capacity GEOs where my company's focused. You've got multiple bands. No longer are you thinking of using just the traditional C, KU, KA, LNS for mobile, but also the Q and V bands, the 40, 50, 60, 70, even 80 gigahertz bands that we're also seeing as part of terrestrial 5G are a critical part of satellite 5G. And so that's got to be something that's included. And really what you're seeing is greater capacity at a lower cost. Next slide, please. And satellite's going to bring something to 5G. I mean, terrestrial 5G, everyone agrees is terrific, but you're going to need this for things, whether it's backhaul in rural areas, pushing data. We talked about converged media, broadband. And when we're talking about broadband, I want to stay for a second. I think there's still a misconception on satellite, from 10, 15, 20 years ago that it's slow. Well, today we're offering speeds of 100 megs and more in many spots across the globe, and certainly across the United States. We're already seeing integration with 5G ongoing. There's lots of testing. And so satellite's bringing service everywhere, adding resiliency and adding reliability, which if you're really going to achieve the vision of 5G and you're really going to solve the issue of the digital divide, you're going to have more than terrestrial services. These non-terrestrial services, such as satellite, are going to be key to achieve any country's goals. Next slide, please. Is that it? Oh, no. So what I've been saying, so US leadership, Canadian leadership, certainly, a huge portion of Canada remains uncovered and heavily reliant on satellite. Huge portions of the United States, I can't remember the last number, but I believe it's around 16 or 18 million. They're still unserved or underserved by terrestrial in the United States. No one's running in there to provide those services but satellite operators. So we've got the ability to come in, and you did see that in the pandemic. I think one of the real benefits of satellite is once we're up, we're in service. And so what we were seeing during the pandemic, we were able to bring service to users, consumers who didn't have service. We serve primarily in the Americas in my company. Other companies, of course, serve more areas. We were able to get service out in 2 or 3 days from the time of a service call. You didn't have to build out terrestrial infrastructure to reach those users, and able to come up with some really creative ways of delivering service that's going to be the same way we deliver 5G, whether it's through wireless Wi-Fi connectivity. So really, when you think of satellite, I would think of it broadly. We are going to be key in remote and unserved areas, but we're also critical for other services, whether it's backhaul, whether it's IoT, machine to machine. And just like the other wireless technologies, we do require access to a sufficient amount of globalized harmonized spectrum to meet our user demands that are growing. So just want to leave you with the thought that satellite is an important part of 5G. It is not the only part, but it's certainly a critical component. So thank you, and I look forward to our questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. Really, useful contribution in terms of the amount of innovation that's going in your industry. How quickly that is changing, and the LEOs going up, the MEOs, the difference in the way that you can offer service. Which, as you say, it struck me that there is a perception that we're where we were 15 years ago, and how we change that. And 5G is that dynamic environment that is going to need lots of different things to contribute. So that's fantastic. And Patrick, what about from a wireless perspective? Where do we stand in the US?
Thanks, Andy, and good morning. So Verizon started thinking about 5G really back in 2015, 2016. And the way we've approached it is thinking of all of the capabilities that the 5G enables. There are really 8. We think of speed and throughput. We have peak data rates of 10 gigabits per second, massive mobile data volume of 10 terabytes per second per square kilometer. We think of mobility and connected devices, mobility of 500 kilometers an hour, the Internet of Things of potentially 1 million devices within a square kilometer. We also think of service deployment and energy efficiency of 10% of today's energy consumption, as well as the ability to deploy new services not measured in days, but really in minutes. And then finally, latency and reliability. In latency, we think of an end-to-end path of, say, 5 milliseconds, and then reliability of the traditional 5 nines. But how do we get there? And there are really 4 inputs or components to that. First, there's fiber, and Verizon over the last several years has been investing heavily in driving fiber throughout major cities and mid-market cities. Second is software-defined network and virtualization. This allows us to reduce costs, creates flexibility and supplier diversity. Third is edge computing, moving the cloud to a distributed framework that allows you to achieve the latency objectives for 5G. And then finally, spectrum, which is the lifeblood of any mobile broadband network. So as Verizon started planning for the next step in the evolution of our network in 2015 and 2016, we focused on millimeter wave, mainly because that was the largest chunk of spectrum available and would allow for us to really check all the boxes to the different 5G capabilities. And Verizon was the first to deploy 5G. First in October of 2018, we deployed 5G Home, which was the fixed wireless access product. And that was phase 1. Phase 2 was deploying 5G in a mobile environment. And we began doing that in 2019. And by the end of 2019, I think we had over 30 cities where we had 5G deployed. And then phase 3 has been expanding that millimeter wave footprint in additional cities, but also deploying 5G NR in existing spectrum bands through the use of dynamic spectrum sharing technologies that allows us to dynamically allocate our existing spectrum resources for 4G LTE as well as 5G NR. And so as we expand that phase 3 into 2020 and beyond, you'll see a movement towards more mid-band spectrum. So Verizon was a very active participant in the CBRS auction. We were the largest winning bidder there. We've been, I think, the most aggressive in deploying GAA over the last 18 months, and we will continue that as well as deploying a spectrum or services on priority access licenses. We're looking forward to the C-band auction that's scheduled for later this year in December. And then we're certainly optimistic about the 100 megahertz of spectrum at 3.45 to 3.55, which the FCC voted on earlier this month on an accelerated basis. So I think with all those efforts that both Verizon and the other carriers are investing in, I think we're well positioned to drive 5G innovation here in the U.S. and hopefully show global leadership both in deployment and new technologies. So Andy, I'll turn it back over to you and we can start the panel discussion.
Great, thanks. It's really helpful to get your perspective in terms of rollout and where you were focusing and the auctions coming up. So thank you, everybody. I think if I just dive in with a couple of questions that struck me from that discussion. Jennifer, from your perspective, how are things going on 3GPP and standards? I mean, surely from a satellite perspective, you rely very heavily on the sort of global standards and how we try and push forward with that. So have you got any thoughts about how that's going in terms of integration with 5G generally?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a great question. I'd actually say very well. So the satellite industry, traditionally hasn't participated in 3GPP. And so it took us a little bit to really get more familiar. We've participated in other standards bodies, ETSI, TIA, and so forth and so on. And one of the things that I think was critical to us was ASOA has become an active participant, which is our one of the key satellite organizations, trade associations out of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. So ASOA has been key and really helping to pull the industry together and trying to make sure we come in with one voice, because we were kind of newcomers. And what I think is really exciting is the MVNOs and the technology providers and other, it took a little bit, but really have embraced us. And we're well on track to becoming part of Release 17, which hopefully will be coming out soon. And I think that's, we still have some work to do. We'll want to broaden what portions, are we in just the network, what bands and so forth. And that gets a little more complicated. But I think we're in a really good place. And it really shows that I think if you talk to companies, and we have a lot of discussions within GSC and with our member companies, really talking to the other operators out there, and whatever the technology, that satellite is seen as a part of 5G. As I said, it's not the only part, but it's certainly a very important component. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I absolutely echo that. And I think it's important, certainly from my perspective, to think of 5G not as a particular sort of technology choice, but it's this bringing together, and I'm sure from a Verizon perspective, you would agree, of IoT and big data and AI, all these things that we're trying to do that together make 5G that exciting place, so that's really helpful. I think, Nesha, if I might, I'll bring you in on the results of the question that we asked the audience. So they were asked, which of the three key components of the FCC's 5G fast strategy do you think is the most urgent to be addressed in order to deliver 5G leadership? And we have pushing more spectrum into the marketplace, 25%. So that's your pipeline of spectrum auctions. Hopefully keep people happy. Those of us that advise on that are very happy if we have lots of that. Thank you. Updating infrastructure policy and encouraging investment, 35%. And modernizing outdated regulations, 40%. So that was the fiber piece. Does that surprise you, or is that what you're seeing from other stakeholders, do you think?
So I was expecting sort of equal distribution a little bit, because I think all of the above is important. You can't have one but not the other. So you need to make improvements on all three basic areas that we identified. And I understand infrastructure is very important, and I also understand that the modernizing outdated regulation is important. Those two are sort of also connected, because some of the infrastructure deployment requires updating outdated regulations. With the technology, new technology, the rules and regulation that previously put in place based on the previous versions of technologies may no longer be valid, or to some extent, actually it may create barriers to either deployment or making sure that new technologies could be, making sure that innovation and investment happening in the marketplace. So as regulators, I think we need to keep in mind that our pen is slower than the technology itself. So maybe approach the regulatory framework more technology neutral and flexible way to the extent that is possible, but also keep an eye all the time for the existing regulations, whether at any point those regulations are becoming, rather than an incentive for innovation and investment, it's becoming a hindrance or a barrier for those. So I think that's FCC has been doing that, and that's our part of 5G plan. And today, yesterday, and tomorrow, we'll continue to improve on all those three areas that the 5G fast plan identifies.
That's great. And I think as a Spectrum conference, it says a lot for how successful you've been in getting Spectrum out already. And we know the great job that you guys have done on millimeter wave and mid-band spectrum already. But that isn't seen as the major or the only blocker now. So I think that's really good. I saw you, Patrick, nodding with that. Are you in agreement about those requirements about helping fiber rollout?
Oh, absolutely. And I shared Nashe's position that, it's really all three of these that are needed. And I think the FCC has done a fantastic job of really pressing for streamlining infrastructure deployment and siting, as well as removing barriers to fiber deployment. But the biggest thing that they've done is really a Herculean task of making more spectrum available. I think it's around just within the last year, it's about 3,400 megahertz of millimeter wave spectrum has been made available through 2 auctions. We have about 530 contiguous megahertz of spectrum in the mid-band in 3 gigahertz that's becoming made available. So, I think the FCC has done a fantastic job of really leaning into the problem, thinking about it holistically, and moving forward with all these important parts.
That's great. And from a Canadian perspective, David, do you sort of do you recognise the responses we've had back from the first poll question, which was about which region is leading the way in 5G rollout? So we have North America 17%. You guys have done pretty well. That's not bad. Europe 3%. Sorry, what can I say? I'm not in Ofcom anymore, so I can't help with that. Other 7%. So somebody's doing well. But Asia Pacific 72%. How does that make you feel, David? Or are you worried about that? Or?
Well, I guess it says at least we're all in the race a little bit if everybody left that as a race. But I think it just says we need to continue to do the work we're doing to open things up and free up the three things that we just talked about. Free up the spectrum, allow us to do the infrastructure build, and make sure the regulatory environment's there that encourages more intense spectrum use and allows for sharing. It's not just about 5G services. I know we didn't go into some of the detail, but a lot of the stuff we're looking at from a regulatory perspective is how do we do some innovation, both in licensing models to open up new services, but also to increase the intensity of usage, because eventually, even if you free up some more for new usages, part of it is making sure it gets used more intensely, and then making sure it's shared without too much complexity. And I think that's that third bucket of modernized regulation is a big part of helping that leadership. It's not just about, I think that leadership message right now is very much about technology and who's deploying a particular piece of technology. There's a lot of other stuff that goes into it longer term. And I think there's a lot of work going on that I've seen in Ofcom in the US and in Canada, and in different parts of Asia on some of that regulatory innovation. Germany's done some, right? So I think, at least coming from a regulatory perspective, that's something that can help considerably, right? Without it making it too complicated.
Yeah, and from your perspective, when you were at BlackBerry, when you were at Nortel, is technology leadership with 5G important from a developing really exciting good technology in Canada, or is it all about getting usage of 5G as a technology?
Probably.
And you're not allowed to say both because we're just trying to.
Yeah, I actually could say both. Look, from a society perspective, benefits. Right. Look, from a society perspective, the benefits accrue from the services. Right. It's not necessarily dependent on who provides them. If you're a technology company, my experience in technology companies, if you're not at that leading edge of innovation, and I've been through two that fell behind, it typically doesn't work that well for you. So I'll leave it at that.
It's hard, and I guess to bring Nesha you in from the FCC, how important is from your perspective when we talk about 5G leadership? Do you think that is about developing technology in the US and building that, or is it about it being rolled out by Verizon and other companies or by satellite operators and developing those great services to consumers and businesses? Is there a tension there, or do you think both?
I do not think there is any tension. I think it is an ecosystem we are talking about here, and a 5G ecosystem. As we talked about, 5G is a revolutionary, it's a technology that will not just be connecting or affecting the communication sector, but it's going to be affecting every other sectors out there, and we are seeing that. And innovations and investment in these network and allowing connectivity to be deployed everywhere in the United States is the first step. But the services that's going to be provided over it's where the innovation and the small or large new players will show up. So we are not just talking about a 3G network where once it's deployed, we know exactly what kind of services is going to be provided over. It's higher speed, the broadband and voice. We are talking about actually affecting every part of the industry out there, from the manufacturing to transportation, autonomous, cars, to everything that connecting everything to everything. It's not just connecting people to things or people. So from that perspective, I see there isn't a. I see the 5G deployment is part of the progress that we are making, but the progress is not going to stop or once we have the deployment, because I think the most important thing is the creating ecosystem as a regulator where new services and new players could actually experiment and bring value and add value to the system already put in place. So I do see this is FCC is trying to do exactly that, making sure that spectrum is out there and removing all regulatory barriers and allowing a market-based solutions and market-based innovation and investment to happen rather than government-regulated innovations and investment happening.
Sounds great. I'm looking at some of the questions we've had from people, and Patrick, one for you. Was there a need for all the 17 gigahertz of spectrum that was assigned to mobile at WRC 19 when you've got all this spectrum available in the millimeter wave and you're not using it all at the minute?
Absolutely. Verizon began deploying millimeter wave bands back in 2018. That deployment will continue as technology evolves to allow us to use even wider channel bandwidth. So starting with 800 megahertz, we'll soon be able to extend it to 1600 megahertz. And the other carriers will also be doing the same thing. So one of the beautiful parts of the regulatory regime here in the United States is that these are flexible exclusive use licenses. And so we have to internalize the opportunity cost of alternative uses, and it allows us to constantly upgrade our technologies as the needs of consumers change. So we don't have to go back to the FCC and ask for permission to move from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G. We can make those economic decisions ourselves. So, Have we deployed everywhere all at once? Absolutely not. It takes time to deploy a network. It's not just about having the spectrum. It's about deploying fiber. It's about making sure that we have the tower infrastructure there in place. So it'll take time. We're still early in the game, but that spectrum is critical to really meet the capabilities and the full potential of 5G.
Great, thank you. Got a good question here from Brett Tarnutzer at the GSMA, a very good colleague of mine. Given yesterday's Nobel Prize in Economics being awarded for, in part, spectrum auctions, and I must say, from myself, congratulations to Paul Milgram, particularly on that, who I've worked with and continue to work with very closely on lots of things. So I think it's phenomenal for us as a industry to have that. But given the importance of spectrum for 5G, what does the panel think of the future role of auctions will be, given how encumbered most spectrum is and the fact that satellite companies are generally not subject to spectrum auctions? Or this sounds like an excellent one for Jennifer and Patrick to go first. But I think we need to get the regulator's perspective too, because Brett was at the FCC, so I'm sure he's thinking of that side as well. Who wants to start? Jennifer, go for it.
So actually, Brett, say hi. Well, first off, congratulations to Paul as well, and saw a great video this morning on the Today Show. I guess he was sleeping when they tried to call him.
Yes, I saw that.
So his co-winner lives next door. But anyway, congratulations. Brett actually was an intern at the FCC when I was at the FCC. He's only a couple of years younger, but and when auctions were first enacted into legislation. So I do want to start with the purpose of auctions. And auctions was never meant to be an inter-service purpose. It was meant to be where you had mutually exclusive applications trying to obtain licenses for the same service, in this case wireless, mobile wireless. How would you make that decision? And that was important because if you think about it, and people know I don't love auctions, but I've never thought of a better way, so I can't really criticize it. But we had comparative hearings, we had lotteries, we tried all these different things, and they were a terrible way at assigning spectrum. So they were meant to be an assignment purpose. The Communications Act, I'm talking in the U.S., requires us to look at the public interest when making licensing and other decisions. What we've seen happen over time, in my view, because of auctions, is that the public interest has equated with how much money we can bring in for the Treasury or for other purposes. And you can't really decide what to do with spectrum. I actually believe that we should be starting to relook at the spectrum regime in this regard and look at what is the right way to allocate spectrum. I'll go back to what Patrick was talking about, the 17 gigahertz of spectrum, which was identified for IMT at the WRC. A number of those bands, including 37.5 to 40, 47.2 to 48.2, et cetera, are bands that satellites operate in. They're co-primary. You've now identified that spectrum for IMT. The FCC, of course, and I know Industry Canada has been doing the same thing, and other governments are trying to figure out how do you enable the use for both uses. The FCC did try to have an auction where they did inter-service, 28 gigahertz, I believe, and some of the other upper bands. It wasn't successful, largely because you're talking about very different uses. These were bands for feeder links that satellites use, which are very discrete areas with protection zones of a couple of kilometers, but they were auctioning off counties or partial economic areas. So you didn't have the same use. So I don't see auctions as the be-in and the all. And I know, I think they've been very successful in the US for what they've been used for, which is assigning spectrum among competing licensees. I don't see it as a way to solve the inter-service issue. I think that allocations need to be made based on the public interest in the United States and elsewhere, whatever the proper term of art is in each country. But you can't say that auctions serve the public interest. That's never been a statutory in the US determination. So I'm happy to discuss further.
I'm going to give a quick response for Patrick, but I'm conscious we've got about 10 questions waiting and only 10 minutes left. So Patrick, quick response: auctions, love them or hate them?
auctions have been widely successful here in the United States, and it does serve the public interest. The Section 309J, which governs competitive bidding for the FCC, specifically says that auction revenue should not be is not a part of the public interest standard. So it's not about raising money. It's about having a fair, transparent mechanism for assigning spectrum to the highest and best use. And while satellite is a different service, as we saw from Jennifer's presentation, they're providing a functionally equivalent service to what mobile broadband networks are doing here. So extending an auction mechanism to satellite bands, I think, is something that the FCC and other regulators should consider.
Okay. Challenging with global versus local, but I'm going to pause on that one for the regulators, if that's okay. Quick question. What do you think of countries that promote auctions and 5G networks without having full 4G coverage? How can we avoid the modernization? How could we avoid the modernization of networks, increasing the digital divide and making more complex the access to low-income populations to telecom services? So to the two regulators, are we just encouraging lots of 5G in urban areas and rural areas will actually get a worse coverage and will have a greater divide than if you didn't push 5G? Whoever would like to go first.
I'll go first. So first of all, I want to comment on the previous auction question to say that FCC has been using the auctions actually not just to resolve mutually exclusive applications, but also we used it for incentive auctions or reverse auctions. So auction has actually a number of policy objectives currently the way we are using. We used it to clear the spectrum. We also used it to make sure that our USF funding is distributed in the best manner possible. So to answer your question about rural versus urban, whether we are creating a more digital divide, any 5G plan needs to also take into account how we want to make sure that the such divide is not widening. Are there any things that the regulator could do to make sure innovations and investment is being done everywhere for us in the United States, whether it is a rural area or remote area or areas that otherwise couldn't have any kind of on its own services. So we have a universal service plan, and FCC has allocated nearly $20 billion for deployment in the areas that do not have services today. So we have that universal service plan focusing on not just wired network deployment, fast networks, but also we have the mobile component to it. We also are making sure that when we are licensing, in each licensing case, we make sure what might be the use case. And the smaller the geographic areas you license, for example, you give more opportunities in the rural areas, small and rural carriers to obtain those licenses to provide service to those. And the service rules and other tools that we have a number of tools in our toolbox. As regulators, we use everything to make sure that every American are actually going to be enjoying the services of 5G and next generation.
And David, is that the same for you?
Yeah, pretty similar. I'll say three quick things. It's not one or the other. We've got significant investments going on to do rural coverage. And I think one of the things that we hear significantly, and that has been quite a topic in Canada, it's come up around MVNOs and other mechanisms, is that investment dollars for our telecom companies across the piece, small, medium, or large, are an important aspect. So 5G capacity in urban areas, if that makes it lower cost to deploy there and leaves more funding available to do rural deployments, is a key aspect we keep hearing about. And I'll leave it there. But those are the debates. I don't think looking at it as one or the other, or necessarily slowing things down, makes it any better for the digital divide, which is an important issue.
Got you. I've got a question here for you again, David, from Toby Ewell at Policy Tracker. So Telesat has an interesting proposal to manage part of the C-band in Canada itself and to make it available for terrestrial 5G on a leasing basis, and to use the revenue in part to repacket services to the upper parts of the band. So rather than doing an incentive auction approach, to effectively leave it with them and then allow them to lease it to a mobile operator. Does the panel think satellite operators can make good spectrum landlords? Wow, Jennifer, you could be a landlord and let Patrick use some of your spectrum. Is this a good model for 5G leadership? Says Tony. To you, David, first.
Yeah, so actually that's one, because that's an active and open consultation for us. I really can't. I really can't on that one.
We'll protect you from it then, and have the others give a quick comment. Jennifer?
I'm happy to say that my company is not a C-band licensee. I'm not, I don't think I'm in a position to answer that question. I apologize.
No problem. Patrick?
I'm a little hesitant to wade in too much into C-band because we're under the anti-collusion quiet.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'll take the same from you, Nesha. Other questions, and we've got lots of them here. One for Jennifer. Satellite services are great. However, the price of the services is still well above the average prices for terrestrial broadband service. And in general, they have less demand than terrestrial broadband services. How to balance this apparent imbalance so that both technology, satellite and terrestrial, are in a more balanced position in terms of demand, price, and of course, spectrum allocation. That comes from Ricardo from the IFT in Mexico.
So thank you. So our services are priced in a comparable way to terrestrial. So and in some ways we are actually able to bring services out a different way. And I want to just go back to one thing that I do want to bring up on adoption, because I really think this goes to the overall issue that we're dancing around. We spend a lot of time talking about, how do you get service out? But you're not going to get service out if people don't adopt it. I thought one of the truly amazing things about the pandemic was, I know Verizon, I know other companies, whether satellite, terrestrial, whatever, fiber, have all seen huge or dramatic increases because of the pandemic. Because as Neshe started the panel, I believe, we're teleworking, tele-school educating, tele-healthing, all these things are going on. Will that continue post-pandemic? I don't know. So one thing that I think is critical, and this goes to everything, is, there's folks in rural areas who choose to live in rural areas because they also don't want to connect. People live, there's I think Canada says this often, there's implications to where I don't think I have it quite right, but David knows what I'm trying to say. When you choose to live somewhere, there's some implications. Satellite, and it depends what service we're talking about. Is it satellite broadband? Is it IoT? Is it, any of these other precision agriculture? There's so many services that are offered. So I don't know really how to respond to the price, but I do think the service is out there today. There's capacity out there today. We're adding more and more satellites as an industry and more options. So for instance, in Mexico, my company, other companies like Viasat, other members of the GSC are out providing Wi-Fi in rural areas. And that's actually a very cost-effective solution for users who can't afford a monthly subscription fee, who may only have a few dollars a month. So I think you have to look at how the market works to respond to these things. Is universal service our goal, or is universal access our goal? in some places, without some sort of funding support, you may never get to universal service, but you also may never get everyone to adopt unless there's a reason for people to adopt. So I think it's a complex question. I don't have a good answer for it, but I do think we're certainly part of the solution. And and what we have seen is a dramatic decrease in our prices as technology improves, just like in the wireless world and other worlds. So thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So we've got just a couple of minutes left. Thank you to the audience for all those great questions. I just want to hand it over to the panelists for one last comment from each of you, either a request for somebody else on the panel or something you've learned or something you're going to take away. But any last comment from each of you? David, why don't we start with you?
Oh, well, David, I think what I touched on spectrum intensity and how we share it and how we get to better allocation and sharing models is the key thing as all the demands we see on different aspects, right? And being able to put a set of rules that continues supporting it. Those are probably the two things that sort of keep us away beyond the standard business.
Great point. So Nesha?
We were talking about the 5G and what we are doing domestically, but there's also a lot going on internationally. And I look forward to working with everyone, all our counterparts towards WRC 23. So we have a number of agenda items that will be critical to the next generation services. So we'll look forward to working with CTEL in the CTEL context and ITU WRC context.
Sounds fantastic. And just to note, the UK is always very happy to talk to people. Brexit means we've got less friends at the minute. So very happy to talk to anyone about spectrum. Patrick?
I think I'd like to build on what David said. Policymakers and spectrum users, we're always looking for ways to use spectrum more intensely and efficiently. And we need to learn from the current models. Unlicensed has been widely successful. Flexible exclusive use licenses that have been auctioned has been exceedingly successful. But as we move into an environment where spectrum sharing becomes more and more important, we have to be thoughtful about how we develop those frameworks to make sure that we're leveraging a lot of the lessons we've learned from unlicensed and from flexible exclusive use to make sure that the incentives are there and we're still serving the public interest.
Perfect. Jennifer, the very last word can come from you.
Thank you. So I'd like to focus on technology neutrality, and I actually do echo Patrick's words on flexibility as well. I think and technology neutrality doesn't mean equality, but it needs to be that regulators and policymakers have to understand that there's more than one or two technologies, and that was probably the most disappointing part of the panel for me, was that our first two panelists who came from the government had no focus at all on satellite, which is going to be a part of 5G. So that would be my request, is for folks to really take into account whether it's satellite, whether it's UAVs. I mean, you can name a million different technologies. They're all going to be a part of 5G for us to be successful, and we have to think in that way.
Okay, great point to end on, and thank you everyone. Thank you for the audience for so many great questions, and thanks Dan for making it possible for us.
Thank you, Andy, and I'd like to also add my thanks to all of the panelists. So thank you guys. That really was an interesting panel, and I think shown by the number of questions that we had from the audience. So thank you everyone out there for all those questions. I think we got around to quite a few of them. For those that we didn't get around to, what we might do, if it's okay with you guys on the panel, we'll send those questions to you by email, and if there are any that you wanted to pick up on with individuals afterwards, then be able to do that. So we will send those around to you. So wonderful. So look, thank you all so much again for that. As I said, a great start to the day, a really fascinating panel. So we're now moving straight on to our showcase session. So the first of our showcase sessions. So if you click on the stage tabs, on the left-hand side of your menu, you'll see there's 3 different showcase stages that are now live. So we have 3 sessions that are being led by some of our partner organizations for the event. So on showcase stage 1, you can see a session which is focusing on OnGo CBRS shared spectrum, which is hosted by the CBRS Alliance. Showcase Stage 2, you can pick up on some of the issues that I'm sure have been covered in this session already by Jennifer, looking at satellites and 5G, and that's a session hosted by GVF and GSC. And on Showcase Stage 3, we have a session which is looking at 5G and edge computing. So looking at transformational performance with 5G and mobile edge computing, hosted by Verizon. So those sessions are starting now in just a couple of minutes. Following that, we do have a short break, and then we're back here on the main session at 11:20 local Washington, D.C. time for our next plenary session, which is looking at technology and policy tools to increase spectrum efficiency. But once again, thank you so much to Andy and to all of the panelists for that session. Please do make your way now over to one of the showcase sessions, and hope you enjoy those, and looking forward to seeing you back here on the main session, on the main stage, I should say, in just about an hour or so's time. So see you again shortly. Thank you, everyone.